Hi, I'm Lauren, a mom, former teacher turned children's book author, and your host who joins special guests each episode as we share our top kid-lit picks for sparking hard conversations the easy way. Yep, that means everything from tackling bullying and out of control anger to celebrating diversity, inclusion, and leading with kindness, plus so much more. My whole mission of my own children's book series, Blooming Rose, is to provide social and emotional support tools for in and out of the classroom, and this podcast is my way to expand that mission even further. So stay tuned as we dive into this week's topic on the Blooming Books podcast. Welcome back to the Blooming Books podcast. This is a very exciting bonus spotlight episode with award-winning author and illustrator Brian Selznick. I tell you guys, when I was reading over his media sheet, it is quite the achievement list, from a #1 New York Times bestseller, selling millions of books worldwide, to having not one, but 2 books adapted to film, the first of which being a 5-time Oscar-winning film directed by none other than Martin Scorsese. So to countless media appearances and recognitions, and the pinnacle for all book illustrations, which is winning the Caldecott Medal in 2008. We have so much to dive into, but without further ado, Brian, welcome to our little podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Okay, so we'll pick your brain about your books and processes in a little bit more in a minute, but I'd love to kick things off with some rapid fire questions to get to know a little bit more about you. So are you ready? All right,
I'm
number
ready.
1. It looks like you are bi-coastal. So you're bouncing from Brooklyn and La Jolla outside of San Diego. I've been there into Seal Beach, and it's such a dreamy little sea town. But how do you choose where to spend your time, and where are you now?
I'm in San Diego right now in La Jolla, about a block from the ocean. I can actually see it out my
Oh,
window in front of me. My husband teaches at UC San Diego. He's a professor
okay.
in the communication department. So we basically I try to be here with him during the school year.
Hmm.
And then we come back to New York during the holidays and the summer. But I often have other things to do in New York. It's where my publishers are. It's where a lot of our family and friends are. So I'm often heading back to New York by myself and then coming here. So it's a relatively random schedule, and I never quite know where I'm going to be even a few weeks in the future.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I imagine a lot of your work is in New York. And you said the holidays. We just went to, I used to live in New York. My husband worked in New York for a few years, but we're from Texas, or we're from Louisiana, and we're here in Texas now. But
Oh,
we just holidayed up in New York around Christmas time, and just
oh,
walking down, Fifth Avenue, seeing all of the holiday things it's such a special time in the city. So
yeah,
it's great that you get the best of both worlds.
absolutely.
So, number 2, you are both an author and an illustrator. So, was there one passion that came first, like a love for writing or for drawing, or is it that kind of like, chicken or the egg scenario for you?
I definitely started off as an artist. I
Hmm.
drew all the time. I made things all the time when I was a kid. And I wrote as a kid, but I never thought of myself as a writer. It wasn't until I got out of art school, I went to Rhode Island School of Design, that I decided to get into children's books. And I really only began to formally write because I needed something to draw. And I wrote my first book, the Houdini box, so that I essentially would have something to illustrate, and created it as a kind of portfolio piece, but then it itself ended up getting published in 1991. And I wrote a few books after that. Although I mostly illustrated for a long time for other writers. And then ever since I made The Invention of Hugo Cabret in 2007, I have much more clearly thought of myself as both a writer and an illustrator.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I mean, you're just talented, so why not do both? The Washington Post has described you as a rare creator capable of following one masterpiece with another. So, now that you've reached this level of notoriety, do you feel the pressure when you're sitting down for your next project? Like, what's the next masterpiece?
It's lovely to hear things like that.
Yeah.
You make books, you want people to read them, you want them to go out into the world, you want to connect with people, and it's nice to have had success. But every time you sit down to make another book, unless you're really just repeating yourself, and even that's not gonna probably be a good idea in terms of people reading your work, I guess basically I should just say for myself, every time I sit down
Hmm.
and start working on a new book, I am aware that I'm taking everything I've learned from my previous books, because I'm always trying to learn new things, but then trying to do something new with it. So things like what people are going to think, what people are going to say, how people are going to connect or compare what I'm making to what I've made doesn't actually come into my mind. Like the positive stuff that has happened makes me feel good, right?
Yeah.
That is really, really nice. But it doesn't help me make another book. But it also doesn't scare me or intimidate me and keep me from making another book. So I guess I'm generally pretty good at compartmentalizing.
Yeah.
And I think we all have to find ways to compartmentalize just to get through any given day. And I feel like when I'm actually inside of a story, when I'm trying to figure out what the narrative is going to be, and usually my books could take, 3 to 5 years or more. I'm very focused on the literal aspects of the plot, like what is going to happen next, what is this character saying, and I always write first before I draw. So eventually, it then becomes what am I going to draw, or how am I going to draw this, or what are these elements going to look like? And then I guess once the book is finished, between a book being finished and it being published, there's usually about a year during which you're working on something else. So then the book comes out and you have to put the thing you're working on aside and go back to the thing you finished a year earlier. And and then if you're lucky, like I am, I get to go out on the road and get to speak at bookstores and libraries and sometimes at schools, and it's really exciting. I just finished a month and a half long, actually 2.5 month long tour for my new book, Run Away with Me. And I got to go to all these places and all around the country to talk about this book. And then I guess you can begin to see how people are connecting with it. But but for me, it's really very much about figuring out what happens inside the narrative.
Yeah. And I think I was just on an author forum yesterday reading how someone was trying to crack the code on how to make, I think they called it like the golden goose or the golden egg, that one special book that's going to, top the charts and do all this and
Oh
blah, blah, blah.
God,
But it's just like there's no
don't
way
do that.
there's no formula for it. So I
Yeah.
think as an artist, as an author, as an illustrator, like that's exactly the way you should be, is just focusing on quality. And that's what I tell authors that ask me like, well, how did you publish your first book and all these things? I'm like, you just really have to focus on um, you know, the story that you're putting out, and then the rest can follow, right?
Yeah, I think starting with the goal of making something successful is not the right goal.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might happen. I once heard a person talk about how their goal for their book was to be at the top of the New York Times bestseller list and be in the windows at Macy's and have a Thanksgiving Day float. And I was at a very low point in my career when I heard this person speak, and I thought to myself, even then, that is the wrong goal. And
Hmm.
they achieved that goal. Like that book that they published did every single one of those things that they wanted. But I remember thinking even then, are people going to, great, that's incredible. I couldn't even imagine that kind of success at the time because my books weren't not selling. But are people going to be reading that book in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? And it really helped me focus. And then of course, like I look at The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which is about a boy who loves French silent films. So if you were setting out to try to find this formula that you were discussing, this golden egg, it's about the last book
I was gonna say, is
anybody
it
would ever.
trending on Instagram right now?
It's the last thing anybody would ever tell you to do. But it's the thing that was interesting to me.
Hmm.
I like French silent movies. I like elements of this story. I was fascinated enough to spend 3 years of my life trying to figure out what happened. And there was no clear indication at any point that anybody would want to read this. But other than the fact that my editor liked what I was doing and I liked what I was doing. And again, like I didn't know what the narrative was going to be for a lot of that time. I was figuring it out. But and so yeah, so you have to do what you want to do.
Yeah. And I think that's really what comes at the end of the day, what comes out through great stories is the genuine passion behind, the storyteller.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's the secret, right? Okay, so your books are geared for middle grade to young adult. So that lends itself to longer storytelling formats because we talk about a lot of picture books on this podcast, but the longer formats, the character building themes woven in, but you're known for mixing almost equal parts, written word with the wordless illustrations for your storytelling. My daughter is reading Wonderstruck right now. She's in fourth
Oh,
grade, almost in fifth grade, so that's like right up her jam. She's loving it, but she wanted me to ask you. How
yes.
did you come up with that concept of storytelling?
Mm. Well, tell her that's a very good. Well, hopefully she'll listen to this and I can say
Yes,
that's a
she
very
will.
good
She does. I
question.
make her listen. Yeah. But she will want to on this one.
What's her name?
Avery.
Avery. Avery. Thanks, Avery. Good
Hmm.
question. Well, Avery, when I was making The Invention of Hugo Cabret, I had already been making books for about 15 years, and I had done a lot of picture books, and I had done some chapter books. A lot of the chapter books had, that were written by other people. I would do maybe one drawing a chapter, which is a very
Hmm.
traditional way to illustrate a chapter book. And when I started working on The Invention of Hugo Cabret, I thought it was going to be a 98-page novella. Like I thought it was going to be very short. And I thought it was going to have one drawing per chapter. But then I realized the stories about movies. I thought about the way movies tell their stories with the movie camera, and that's a very visual medium. And then I thought about Where the Wild Things Are, which is my favorite book.
Hmm.
And I thought about The Wild Rumpus, where there's no more white space on the page, there's no more words. It's just a full page bleed, which means the pictures go all the way off the edges for 6 pages. And you just turn the page as the reader to see what comes next. And I thought, well, Hugo, the story I'm writing is about movies and visual storytelling. So if a 6-page Wild Rumpus is really exciting in a 32-page picture book, what if there were 40-page Wild Rumpuses every couple of pages in a 600-page book? And so I went back and I took out from the text I had written everything I thought I could draw. All the descriptions, all the action, some of the emotion, because I thought I didn't need to say Hugo was sad. I could show a picture of his face with him
Hmm.
looking sad. And I didn't want to repeat anything in the text with pictures, and I didn't want to repeat anything with pictures in the text, so that the narrative would flow from beginning to end, but it would keep getting handed back and forth between words and pictures, the way the story in Where the Wild Things Are leads up to the Wild Rumpus, then you go through the Wild Rumpus, and then at the end of the Wild Rumpus, it's after the Wild Rumpus, and you
Yeah.
then continue the story. And I got really excited about that idea because it was challenging, but it was really fun to do. And my goal was when you finished reading The Invention of Hugo Cabret, you wouldn't remember what you saw and what you read, that in your mind you would just remember the story and the characters. So when I was doing Wonderstruck, I said earlier that I always like to do something new. I had learned a lot making Hugo. I never made a book like that before, but I didn't want to make another one just like it. So I thought, what if I separate the story in the words and the story in the pictures? So I tell two different stories, one with words and one with pictures, have them weave back and forth till they come together at the end. And then I saw a documentary about deaf culture and people who were deaf and couldn't hear. And someone in that documentary talked about how uh, deafness, deaf people are a very visual people because even their language, sign language, is something that you look at to understand. And I thought, oh, that'd be really interesting if I told the story about a deaf kid through pictures, because I had to go back and figure out another way to use words and pictures. And that's how it began. So Thanks, Avery, for that very good question.
It's so interesting, and we've talked about it, and we'll get more into Wonderstruck in just a minute. But yeah, it's when I first heard like the synopsis of it, I was like, that is really cool, and I wanted to see how you did it, and you do it beautifully. So it's
Thank
awesome.
you.
So your groundbreaking book was The Invention of Hugo Cabret. So since we're all about social and emotional connections here, can you tell us a little bit about that book and the emotions you wanted the main character Hugo and young readers to journey through in that story? I mean, it's a pretty powerful story of little
Thank
Hugo
you.
there.
Yeah, I began writing it knowing a little bit about George Méliès, the filmmaker,
Hmm.
and I based most of the structure of the story on his actual life, his career as a filmmaker, losing everything during at the beginning of World War One, becoming a toy seller in the Montparnasse train station, and then eventually being rediscovered and celebrated. That's all true, and that's all in the invention of Hugo Cabret.
Yeah.
But then I began to imagine this boy who's living secretly in the walls of the train station. I had learned that in real life, George Méliès had a collection of automatons that at the end of his life were destroyed and thrown away. And I pictured this kid finding one of them and trying to fix it. And that's how the story began. And I'm very literal minded when I'm working. It's like, what happens next? Why does this happen? And I don't generally think very much about themes, and I don't really think about emotions
Yeah.
when I'm writing. I'm thinking about what happens next. But when I was writing Hugo, I knew that he was going to fix the automaton. It was going to start. Originally, I was going to write something like a poem, but I ultimately decided it was going to draw something. I was like, and then it's going to sign the name of the person who made it. And somehow that message in the automaton was going to save Hugo and save Méliès. But I didn't know what it was going to write or draw. I had no idea. And it felt like I had made a story with a hole in the center. And I didn't know how to fill that hole. And what I was missing, of course, was the emotion. Like that was the part that wasn't there. Although I wouldn't have been able to express that at the time. It was just a part of the story I hadn't figured out. And right before I started working on Hugo, my dad died. He'd been sick for about a year. And I remember very consciously during the time I was writing the book, thinking to myself that I did not want Hugo's dad to die. And,
Yeah.
and, and my thinking was I didn't want Hugo to deal with it. But probably what that actually meant was I didn't want me to deal with it or think about it. And so for a while, the dad was going to be the bad guy. Like I would rather have the dad as the bad guy than as the dead person. But that didn't work. And then I had this uncle character that wasn't quite working. Anyway, I remember the day I was sitting at my desk and just realized it was a year after I'd been writing this story that Hugo's dad needed to die. And
Mhm.
that once I figured that out, suddenly the whole reason for the story fell into place. Hugo's father is the person who had found the automaton. When he fixes the automaton, it's with the belief that the message is going to be from his father who he's lost, and that message is going to save him. And of course, within the story, it's kind of a coincidence. It's not actually a message from his father, but it's not a magical story. I mean, it's a story that takes place in the real world. But there are coincidences because there are coincidences in real life. And the message that the automaton ends up creating is, in fact, related to something that the father had talked to Hugo about. And I remembered feeling like dominoes falling into place. Like everything then just made
Clicked.
sense.
Yeah.
Everything clicked. Uh,
Literally in the little
yeah,
inside
yeah,
the
and
automaton.
then, but still, if you were to have asked me what that book was about, I would have said it's about a kid who finds a broken machine and lives meets an old man in a train station. But when I was on tour, a reader came up to me, an adult reader, and said that they really loved the book and they loved the fact that it's a book about how we make our own families.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh my gosh, it is. Like I knew I wanted Hugo to be happy at the end. I wanted him to be safe. He starts the story off as an orphan. I want him to find you know, a safe place to live. But I hadn't consciously thought about the idea of the way we make our own families. And it hit me very hard. So I told the person that I was now going to tell everyone for the rest of time that that had been my intention because it was so obvious. I was like, oh my God, of course that's what my book is about. And then all my books since then have consciously been about that,
Yeah.
but in a way that I mean, they're the books I would have written anyway. But I just, especially as a queer person growing up in a straight family and not really knowing any other queer people until I got to college, and then really not till I got to New York and discovered I was part of a culture, that I was part of a history, that queer people have always existed, and we go back to the beginning of time, and we've always found ways to survive. That theme, which is a metaphor in Hugo and Wonderstruck, uh, and then in the Marvels it becomes more literal because there are queer characters in the Marvels, and then it becomes very much the center of what this new book, Run Away with Me, the young adult novel my first young adult novel that I just finished, that's very much what it's about. So for me, I think weirdly, I work in a backwards way because that process repeats itself. I come up with the plot first, and then it very often in all the books I've done since Hugo takes me a while to figure out the emotion. Often it's the last thing I think of that comes to me. And then that drives the story that I've been creating, making it seem like that's what I started with.
All
But
along. Yeah. You meant
yeah,
to do that.
so I can't recommend this as advice for anybody to like help them, but this I other than we all work in different ways.
Hmm.
And so if you work in a way that's different from what you're being told you should be doing, that may not necessarily be a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love like it's just like that overarching belongingness, finding where you belong, whether it's, from where you started in the beginning or whether you need to forge that new path and go find where that is. So I love that. So were you surprised by the recognition, the accolades that Hugo started gaining, including winning the Caldecott Medal for your illustrations and then being approached to adapt it into what became an Oscar-winning film titled
Yeah, I
Hugo?
mean, I mean, I think given what I've talked about in terms of not thinking anybody was
Hmm.
going to read it, I could honestly say everything about that book was a surprise. The way it connected with readers, the fact that people from the movie world wanted to adapt it. I was getting what felt like dozens and dozens of emails from different actors and directors and producers and agents who wanted to talk to me about adapting the book. And ultimately, this one person contacted me. They were the one person who wrote, this woman named Gray Rembert, who was in the literary department of a producer's office, Graham King. And she was the one person who didn't say, hi, is your book available for rights? What she said is she told me a personal story about how her parents actually had an automaton that terrified her when she was a
Oh,
kid.
wow.
And she so fell in love with Hugo that she wants to make sure he finds a safe home. And that's the way she spoke.
Yeah.
And then it turned out the person she wanted to give the book to was Martin Scorsese. And the combination of those two things, the personal attachment to the book and the idea that, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time may want to make this into a movie was incredibly
Surreal.
surreal. And I
Out
know,
of
but
body. Yeah.
like I always say the word surreal is overused in
Hmm.
conversation, but because it was reality, right? Like it was actually happening to me. But it's as surprising as anybody imagining what would happen if you got that call. Like
Yeah.
it's as surprising as you could imagine it might be. And and then even more surprising is it all happened, right? Because there's a lot of most stories are about maybe some excitement and then nothing ever happening, and it's a miracle anything ever gets
Yeah.
made in Hollywood. And it happened. And the movie, I think, is really beautiful. And Martin Scorsese loved my book, and he made everybody on that movie, from the actors to the special effects team to the production designer, use my book as inspiration.
Well, I was
The
going to
one
say that.
person,
Yeah.
what?
I'm sorry. I was going to say that you could tell that the way he, filmed it, like there was long periods where it is just imagery, and the
Yeah,
imagery and the emotions and the, going through, and then you'll have some, words, but then it'll go back. So it's almost like it's mirroring, the
yeah,
concept that's in the book, which I
yeah.
loved.
And it's not just long sequences that are visual. It's long sequences that are visuals that
Hmm.
are exactly the same as the drawings I did, shot for shot. And so it ended up being a little bit like I accidentally storyboarded a
Yeah.
Martin Scorsese film. And I was going to say the one person who didn't follow anything from my book was Sandy Powell, the Oscar-winning costume designer. And she and I became very fast friends on the set. And I always joke about this with her because she ignored pretty much every costume choice that I made. But I was drawing still images in a book. So I gave Hugo, for instance, a long tuxedo jacket that I imagined he might have taken from the Lost and Found. So when he's running, you could see the flaps going out behind him, indicating movement. But Sandy was making an actual film where there was real movement. So she didn't need to indicate movement.
Mm-hmm.
And what she did was she put him in a jacket and pants that were too small. So it looked like he was growing out of
Yeah.
what he had come with, and it made him more vulnerable, especially because much of the story takes place during the winter. And so he feels more exposed, more cold, and it's a brilliant choice, and that's why she's, who she is. And but I went into Dante Ferretti's office, and he won. Sandy was nominated for Hugo, and Dante was nominated, and he won for the production design. And he had blow-ups of my drawings all over his office.
Wow.
And I have photographs of Martin Scorsese directing the actors, Asa Butterfield and Chloe Moritz, who played Hugo and Isabel, from my book, like open to a drawing and pointing to it as if to say, "This is what you're about to do." So it was an extraordinary experience, and and like I said, like it's now been a part of my life for a really long time, and it
Hmm.
has, and I did get to do things and meet people that I never imagined I would ever get to do, which I'm very grateful for, and it has opened up, some opportunities in terms of, getting to write the screenplay for Wonderstruck, and Sandy Powell brought it to her friend Todd Haynes, who was one of my favorite other filmmakers, and he made the movie of Wonderstruck from my screenplay. Like these are things that happen because of Hugo,
Yeah.
but ultimately, again, when it's time to sit down and make another book, which is my main job and is how I think of myself as a bookmaker, none of that is none of that matters. And even though I'm now aware that anything I write can be brought to someone in Hollywood, which is nice, that's great. Uh, I'm still very consciously making a story that I believe can only be a book and that is supposed to be a book. And I mean, and just one more thing I'll add is that when I was making Hugo, even though it was about silent movies, I was asked a couple times if I thought it could be adapted into a film. And I said no, because the book of Hugo ends with the book that you're reading as part of the plot, as part of the narrative. So I thought it just literally could not be adapted, because at the end of a movie, there's nothing in your hands, there's nothing that you're holding.
Yeah.
But what Scorsese and the screenwriter John Logan did was they took the intention of my book and reversed it while keeping the plot almost the same. And so my book celebrates movies, but is ultimately about the importance of books and writing. And they made a movie that celebrates books and writing, but is ultimately about the importance of film. And I think that's why the movie works so beautifully. And that also showed me that with the right idea, anything can be adapted into anything else.
Yeah. And I love how it kind of loops back to what you're saying earlier about, as an author, an illustrator, an artist, you're thinking about your passion first. And
Mhm.
then when you were talking about them wanting to bring it to the film and how you knew who to choose for the right, people and right team to do it. And it was the people that were passion, like had that genuine passion for it. And I think that comes across both in the book and the film. So that's a really cool way to, think about it.
Yeah.
Um, so, as the Washington Post noted, you followed up with the masterpiece, aka Wonderstruck. Were there any elements from Hugo that you tried to reinvent or incorporate it, or was this a completely clean slate? We kind of touched on this a little bit, but it's a completely different storyline. But obviously, you had more experience now weaving in those, the words and the illustrations and things.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think of Hugo, Wonderstruck, and the Marvels as a trilogy, but they're not a trilogy connected by characters or
Hmm.
story. They're a trilogy connected by structure and themes. And so they all do have something to do with building your own families in different ways. They all use words and pictures in a way that hopefully enhances and underscores the narrative. At least
Hmm.
that's the idea. If like sort of touching on what I was saying earlier, if Hugo uses words and pictures to tell a single narrative that that has cinema at its heart, then Wonderstruck uses pictures, as I said earlier, to parallel the experience of a deaf person. Then the Marvels became a story that uses pictures as memory because the first half of that book, the first 300 pages, are all pictures that tell a story from 1766 to 1900, 5 generations of a theater family. And then there's a hard cut in 1900 during a cliffhanger and a fire in a theater to 1990, which is 90 years later. And the rest of the book essentially is in words. And you're following what seems like a completely different story
Yeah.
until you begin to recognize in the description of the places elements from the first half of the book. So it's a little bit like the pictures then implant memories. And so again, like each book I'm making, I'm trying to do something different. After this, I eventually did a book called Big Tree that I wrote and illustrated, and that started off as a screenplay I was writing. I was invited to write a movie, and then that movie never happened, but I fell in love with the story, so I suggested we turn it into a book. And the book of Big Tree uses all three of the elements that I learned from Hugo Wonderstruck and the Marvels. And then in Run Away with Me, my intention was to have no pictures because it's a young adult
Oh,
novel.
really? Yeah.
And I thought it'd be really radical for me to have no pictures since I draw all the time. But my editor, David Levithan, felt very strongly that this story could potentially benefit from images. And we came up with this idea where the book would open with a essentially a tour of the city of Rome, which is where the book takes place. It's about two 16-year-old boys who fall in love and in Rome in 1986. And so I opened the book with I don't know, I think it's like a 50-page tour essentially of
Rumpus.
Rome.
Yeah.
And you're walking through the empty city. So by the time you get to the story, and you're reading about the obelisk that's on the back of a marble elephant or the Pantheon, which has the big dome and the oculus, the hole in the center, you will remember having seen them in the opening sequence. So essentially what I'm doing, it's a little bit related to the Marvels where I'm playing with memory, but I'm implanting a memory of Rome for any reader, even if they've never actually been to Rome.
Yeah.
So by the time you get into the words, you will have the same memory of the city that, in a parallel way, someone who's actually been there will have had.
That's just so interesting because I mean, hearing you talk about it, it's, all these, like think about things in different ways. And it's really just like about the human experience is how you're telling these stories. And we've always been conditioned to think about, okay, the books use words and movies use images, but you're really, marrying the two um, in these longer format ways, which is really cool.
Yeah, and they've always interacted with each other, right? We
Hmm.
started with silent film, and one of the things I learned making Wonderstruck was that deaf people loved silent movies because all the dialogue was written on the screen. And the coming of sound, which was heralded as a technological triumph, was only a technological triumph for hearing people because
Right.
it eliminated the ability for deaf people to be able to enjoy the movies because suddenly people were talking and turning their backs on the camera and there was no written dialogue. So they could no longer follow the main form of popular culture, which they had been integrated into during silent films. But then, as people began to learn about and think about cinema, a lot of people realized that during the silent movie era, a lot of really, really brilliant techniques had been discovered visually, which then were used in and are often used in sound films as well. And of course, in picture books, there are usually some words, although we do all know of some, really exciting wordless
Hmm.
picture books that are just or even novels that are just images, although that's more rare. But it's always interesting to me the ways in which words and pictures interact with each other.
Yeah. That's one of the biggest things I realized, writing my own picture book. Because I used to be a teacher. I was like copywriter, so I did writing. But, when you go to write picture books in particular, you really have to, like you said, you cut down the descriptions through words because you're doing descriptions through the illustrations as well. So,
Yeah, Maurice Sendak used to talk about it as the difference between illustrating and illuminating. And so, like, if the text says, I mean, there's literal things like if the text says the character's wearing a blue dress, they need to be wearing a blue dress in the picture
right.
if it's a
Yeah.
color picture. But the pictures, I think what he meant by illuminating was the pictures need to add something to the text that isn't there.
Hmm.
And if you are going to have, you know, something, you don't always need, you don't want to repeat yourself. You don't want to have
Yeah. It's
exactly what's
redundant.
in the text, exactly in the pictures, because otherwise, what's the purpose of each? Uh, Chip Kidd, the great designer, book designer, talked about a lesson he learned, I think in college or graduate school, where the teacher put a picture of an apple, a red apple up on the board, and then wrote the word apple and said, pointing to one, you can either have this or you point to the other one. And he said, or you could have that, but you do not need both.
You don't. Yeah.
And that really struck me as well.
Yeah. That's a cool concept to think about, especially as writers.
Yeah.
So my daughter is reading Wonderstruck. It's a pretty long book, but with so many of the illustrations weaved in, I feel like it's such a great way to get these younger kids engaged in longer formats because they love the graphic novels, which are great. But as a former teacher, I love seeing her really dive into these deeper concepts, like getting her, getting all those wheels turning up there. So can you tell us just a little bit about the story Wonderstruck in your own words?
Yeah, it's about two deaf kids who run away from home, one in 1927 and one in 1977, 50 years apart. I picked those years because 1927 was the year that sound was introduced
Okay.
to
Yeah.
cinema, which was the tragedy I was speaking of earlier.
Hmm.
And the girl in 1927 is born deaf, so her picture is told in her story is told in pictures, again to parallel her experience. And then the boy in 1977 is a hearing child who loses his hearing and becomes deaf. And his story is told in all in words, no pictures at all. And I crafted the story or the two stories so that they could help each other. Uh, Even though they're taking place 50 years apart and
Yeah.
they have some elements that are similar. They're, like I said, they're both running away. For instance, the boy loses his hearing by getting struck by lightning through a telephone wire, like on an old-fashioned landline, which can happen. Lightning can travel through
Yeah.
landlines. And I really wanted to draw a picture of lightning, but he has no pictures in his story. So I thought, okay, I'll put some lightning in the other story in 1927 so that I can draw lightning. And then I can have those two things happen at the same time in the
Yeah.
book. Because like I said, the two stories weave back and forth. So I was like, okay, well, why is there lightning in the girl's story in 1927? I thought, well, she could go outside and there's a storm, but that seemed a little boring.
Hmm.
So that's when I thought, oh, that's why she goes to a movie, because in the movie, there will be lightning. And it'll be a movie where there's a storm. And I made up a silent movie called Daughter of the Storm with an actress, because then I needed, like a fake actress. So I made up a character named Lillian Mayhew. And then I thought, oh, the character's really obsessed with Lillian Mayhew. And then I thought, well, why is she obsessed with Lillian Mayhew? Like, why would she care about this character so much? And then that led to a whole other very important element of her story, which I won't go into for anyone who hasn't read the book or
Mhm.
seen the movie. But all of that came because I wanted to draw lightning in the boy's story. And then sometimes when the girl is doing something, I'm able to have the boy in the same moment think about something that might parallel, because we don't have access to her thoughts, right? Because we're looking at her story. So we can imagine if what she's feeling if she looks sad. There's a few moments where she writes down a couple words, so we have access to a couple of things she wants to write down, what she's thinking.
Yeah.
But because the boy's story is all in words, we know everything he's thinking and saying and doing, because it's told from his point of view. And so it's omniscient, but it's all essentially, we never learn anything that he doesn't learn, even though it's not first person. And right. And so that's sort of how the stories came together.
I love that you have all those parallels. And it was fun to watch Avery. I didn't tell her anything really about the book before she started. She saw it and it was like this big and she was like, "Oh, Mom, I can't read all that." And I'm like, "Yes, you can. Like just open it up." And she's like, "Oh, wow," with all the pictures. But once it clicked to her, she was like, "Mom, guess what? Like the boy's story is in words and then the girl's story is in pictures." And so
Good.
just seeing that click was really it's really fun. So, our podcast usually centers around social and emotional themes, and we just did an episode on mindfulness and ways for kids to unplug and immerse themselves in wondrous and creative activities. And of course, reading is a great way to do that. So, is there one feeling or sentiment you want young readers to take away when reading your stories? And I guess, we kind of touched on the belongingness um, that, you always have to find your way. You right?
Yeah. And I'm pretty straightforward when I think about what I want someone to take away from my books, which is really the basic idea that they'll enjoy the story and connect with the characters. Like whoever you are, whether you're like the character, whether you're different from the character, I hope that you find some kind,
Relatability. Yeah.
right? And and I guess this feelings of belongings, like like we were talking, the feeling of belonging we were talking about has become a central theme to everything I do. And I was aware when I was working on Runaway with Me that I wanted to make the case or remind people, especially young people, that even in a world where people don't want us to exist, where they're fighting against our rights or trying to hurt us, that we have still found each other. We have found ways to fall in love. We have found, the family, like we've been discussing. And I finished the book under the Biden administration, and I could not have imagined the world that the book would be published into. But it makes me especially proud to be able to go out on the road and talk about a book with this message and with this theme now, because people, and again, especially young people, will need to be reminded that we have survived this before, we have been through this before. It's going to be really, really hard, and it's going to make a lot of our lives much, much harder and more difficult. But but we can get through it, we can survive, and we can find love. And besides the main story of the two 16-year-old boys who fall in love, there is also three other queer love stories that go back in time, one in the 1940s, one in 1900, and one in the 1600s. And all of these stories weave back and forth,
Mhm.
but they're there to make the point that I'm talking about,
Yeah.
that no matter what is going on in the world, we have existed and have been able to find each other.
Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about inclusion and diversity on the podcast as well. And it's almost like, terrible, hateful things can happen, whether it's, culturally, socially, or even, you look at the tornadoes that are, ripping through the country right now. And it's like in those times of turmoil is where it shines through, and like kind of looping back to the belongingness, like the people that want to come together and support each other and love each other and are there for each other. There's a lot of beauty that if you're looking for it within the ugliness, that is out there. So
Yeah,
I love that.
community and having empathy
Yeah.
and love and being cautious around anyone who seems to vilify empathy or the need to understand others.
Yeah. Okay, so one more question before you go. And you kind of touched on it earlier again, but after all the success you've had and what's no doubt yet to come, what's the one thing you tell authors just starting out in terms of measuring their quote unquote success? Because, it's not always about book sales and movie awards, which, are nice, I'm sure, but what is it for you that you're most proud of in terms of your career, or when readers, that one reader that comes up to you and tells you, that they connected with your books?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that I've struggled with, that I think a lot of people struggle with, is comparing yourself to others. And it's why I had to get off social media almost completely.
Mm-hmm.
I now post if I have a new book out, or if I am going on tour and I want people to come and hear me talk, and I can meet people in person. But I found that the way in which social media amplifies the the comparisons between yourself and everyone else. And somehow, no matter how well you're doing, there's always the sense on social media that everyone else is doing better and
Yeah.
having more fun and having more success. And it just was making me crazy. And I ultimately found a way to control it so that I was using social media the way I wanted to and not the way it wanted me to use it, because it wants to own you
Yeah.
and it wants your time and it wants your emotions and it wants to make you feel bad. It has it
That
has a
addictive
bad
type. Yeah.
intention. It has a bad, but it also does great things, right? It act
Hmm.
in terms of community, it can bring communities together. It can help you find like-minded people, like-minded artists. Like it's not that there's nothing good about it. It's that the bigger umbrella can be so negative. So it's about, so in terms of like the first part of your question, it's it's the thing, and the only reason the only time I ever give advice is if it's something I need to hear myself
Hmm.
and something that I'm working on myself. So it's not even really advice. It's just like, this is what I'm working on, and this is what I've been thinking about, and I've been doing it for a long time. So sometimes I've had more experience than some other people.
Right.
So for me, it's about reminding myself that being compared to or comparing myself to others does not help. And I went to my nephew's graduation recently at Washington University in St. Louis, and Simone Biles was the speaker,
Hmm.
and she was incredible. And one of the things she said that was just really lovely was that she never set out to be the best gymnast in the world, which she is, arguably.
Yep.
She set out to be she said a teacher told her to be the best Simone Biles she could be. And that I just loved that idea. I
Yeah.
just thought, okay, like I can't be Maurice Sendak, and I was friends with Maurice. I got to know him really well. He inspired the invention of Hugo Cabret in a lot of ways, a lot of very direct ways. But I spent a lot of time feeling bad that I wasn't as great as Maurice Sendak. And also like no one is.
Yeah.
By the way, PS, no one is. But I eventually realized that I can't do what Sendak does, but Sendak also doesn't do or couldn't do what I do.
That's right. Yeah.
Mostly because he wouldn't be interested. Like it's not his thing. He does his thing. I do my thing. I'm influenced by him. He's influenced by others, right? Like there is a chain of inspiration, I think, that goes throughout history and spreads out like roots of a tree. And we're all part of that inspiration, whether it's we're taking the inspiration in or others are being inspired by what we make. We're part of that chain, and we should and those roots, and we should use them and remember them and think about them. So the second part of your question, what makes me most happy when I'm talking to people who have read my books, is all of those aspects. When someone tells me that they saw themselves in a character that I created, that they learned something about themselves that they didn't know. And again, like I've had people say to me, Brian, I think you wrote this book just for me because I related to it so strongly, or I loved it so much, or it inspired my love of film, or whatever it is. And my answer is always, well, I did write it for you. Like
Yeah.
that is correct. Because
Oh,
I know what it's like to pick up a book like Where the Wild Things Are, or Michael Chabon's Cavalier and Clay, and just feel like, oh, it was so nice of them to make this book just for me. Like I am clearly the one person that they made this book for. And of course, those are two of the most popular books of all time because so many people feel what I feel. But when I'm feeling it, it's because it's mine. I feel a kind of ownership that and maybe ownership is the wrong word, but a kind of connection to the story that's very profound.
yeah.
So if someone says that to me, I know what that means, and I know the seriousness of that, and that and then if anyone does say that they were inspired by a story or the way I made a story or the pictures that I've made or the way I've told a story with images, it's thrilling. But of course, the only reason I'm telling a story with sequences of images is because Maurice Sendak made The Wild Rumpus and Where the Wild Things Are. And Maurice probably made that because he was thinking about other things that he pulled together, right? So it's which allows me to both be grateful and also to point to the people who I came from, who
Yeah.
my artistic predecessors and ancestors. So yeah, so those are some of the things that make me most proud.
I love that. We talk a lot with kids about, the inclusion and diversity and what a boring world it would be if we're all alike and, facing different challenges and we might be good at one thing and, weaker at another thing and vice versa, and how we identify our differences and how we can celebrate those differences. But also there's just so many things that tie us together too, with the human emotions and things that tie us. So, I love that, I love that about books is that you can pick up the book and, in the children's book I wrote, there's a character that's going through something with a science project. And I always tell the kids, I'm like, okay, well, how have you felt like this? Maybe not, from the science project, but maybe about a reading project or about a sport you were trying or, something like that.
Yeah.
So, um, I love that, with music, with art, with books, with movies, you can always pull out those themes and relate it to your
Yeah.
life. Alrighty. So as always, the books mentioned on our episodes are going to be linked at bloomingrosekids.com/podcast. But Brian, can you tell us, so you have your new book out and that just came out, right? In May?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
April 1st was
Oh,
publication
April
day
1st.
for Find
Yeah.
a Way with Me. And yep, so that's out. There's also a really nice audiobook version, which is available. And I'm working on my next book right now, which I'm in the middle of that struggle trying to
Yeah.
figure out what it's about and what's going to happen next, but it's coming along.
So where can they follow along on Instagram when you are on there posting your important updates?
Yeah, I think my Instagram handle is at the Brian Selznick. .com because at Brian Selznick was taken for some reason.
Oh, really? Yeah,
So
I
it's
think I follow you on Instagram. I think it's like just Brian Selznick or Brian.Selznick or something like
okay.
that. But
Well,
yeah.
you'll put the
Yeah, just
correct link
Google
up.
you. Yeah, you'll find
Yeah, you'll put the correct link up. I am on
it.
Instagram. I do have a website, which is brianselznick.com. And that has information about all my books, all the audiobooks. I'm also a professional puppeteer. I wrote a ballet once. It has information about my movies. So there's links to and there are sites about all of those
Yeah,
various elements.
all the things.
All the
And can't
things.
wait to see what you keep coming up with too. So, what an awe-inspiring episode, Brian. Thank you so much. And we'll see you guys in the fall for our next season of the Blooming Books podcast. So, thanks again.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Blooming Books podcast, recorded and produced by Blooming Rose Kids. We've opted to keep our series ad-free, and if you'd like to support our efforts, please consider shopping our own custom-signed Blooming Rose books at bloomingrosekids.com and our academic materials on our Teachers Pay Teachers page. All of the books mentioned in this episode are also available via our affiliate links in the show notes. We so appreciate you being here and hope to see you next time.